You're tuned in to CICK 93.9 FM Smithers Community Radio. This is River Reads, with host and narrator River Wild. A story hour, where those of all ages can escape into bedtime stories and fairy tales, new and old, but mostly old and at times macabre, or silly, or even perhaps a little confusing, as written in Old English, and the host sometimes fumbles the odd word, and then there's those stories whose premise or message has aged poorly. But let's face it, you can't be picky when you're dependent upon copyright-free material available through Creative Commons. So, if you enjoy a narrated story and don't mind a weird tale, let's begin.
River Reads has been recognized as the recipient of a national award, the Broadcast Dialogue's Canadian Radio Awards, winning Best Podcast in the Small Market category.
River Reads is not a kids' show, but is not a kids' show. Listener's discretion is advised.
This week on River Reads, episode 48, Tarnished Gold, features two longer tales from the collection The Blue Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang, called The Story of Pretty Goldilocks and The Water Lily, the Gold Spinner.
Gender Blender.
And remember to tune in weekly for our Gender Blender segment, where we flip and play with traditional gender roles, reimagining classic fairy tales, flipping one or all gender, or removing it all together, leaving room for all representation, only revealing which tale is our Gender Blender tale at the end of each episode. Ooh, the suspense. And now for River Rambles. Hello. I am your host and narrator, River Wild, recording live from under my stairs, aka not really live, I just record that way to cut down on my editing. And based on my records, today we have read, up to date, we've read over 168 fairy tales on River Reads since our inception on February 25th, 2023. We've read everything from my original works, like The Tiny Giant, to classic fairy tales such as Cinderella and The Daisy, as told by the likes of Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, just to name a few. And today, we have two more kind of macabre ones to taste. And with that, let's begin.
The following is rated GGD, meaning it contains gross gore and/or death.
Listeners' discretion is advised. The Story of Pretty Goldilocks, from The Blue Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time, there was a princess who was the prettiest creature in the world. And because she was so beautiful, and because her hair was like the finest gold and waved and rippled nearly to the ground, she was called Pretty Goldilocks. She always wore a crown of flowers, and her dresses were embroidered with diamonds and pearls, and everybody who saw her fell in love with her. Now, one of her neighbors was a young king who was not married. He was very rich and handsome, and when he heard all that was said about Pretty Goldilocks, though he had never seen her, he fell so deeply in love with her that he could neither eat nor drink. So he resolved to send an ambassador to ask her in marriage. He had a splendid carriage made for his ambassador, and gave them more than 100 horses and 100 servants, and told them to be sure to bring the princess back with them. After they had started, nothing else was talked of at the court, and the king felt so sure that the princess would consent that he set his people to work at pretty dresses and splendid furniture, that they might be ready by the time she came. Meanwhile, the ambassador arrived at the princess's palace and delivered the little message. But whether she happened to be cross that day, or whether the compliment did not please her, it is not known. She only answered that she was very much obliged the king, but she had no wish to be married. The ambassador set off sadly homeward, bringing all the king's presents back with them, for the princess was too well brought up to accept pearls and diamonds when she would not accept the king, so she had only kept 25 English pins, that he might not be vexed. When the ambassador reached the city where the king was waiting impatiently, everybody was very much annoyed with them for not bringing back the princess, and the king cried like a baby, and nobody could console him. Now, there was a court youth who was more clever and attractive than anyone else. They were called Charming, and everyone loved them, expecting a few envious people who were angry, there being the king's favorite and knowing all the state's secrets. Charming happened one day to be with some people who were speaking of the ambassador's return and saying that their going to the princess had not done much good, when Charming said rashly, "If the king had sent me to the Princess Goldilocks, I am sure she would have come back with me." Their enemies at once went to the king and said, "You will hardly believe, sire, what Charming has the audacity to say, that if they had been sent to the Princess Goldilocks, she would certainly have come back. They seem to think that they are so much more attractive than you that the princess would have fallen in love with them and followed them willingly." The king was very angry when he heard this. "Ha ha!" said he. "Do they laugh at my unhappiness and think themselves more fascinating than I am? Go and let them be shut up in my great tower to die of hunger." So the king's guard went to fetch Charming, who had thought no more of their rash speech, and carried them off to prison with great cruelty. The poor prisoner had only a little straw for their bed, and but for a little stream of water which flowed through the tower, they would have died of thirst. One day, when in despair, they said to themselves, "How can I have offended the king? I am his most faithful subject, and have done nothing against him." The king chanced to be passing the tower, and recognizing the voice of his former favorite, he stopped to listen in spite of Charming's enemies, who tried to persuade him to have nothing to do more with the traitor. But the king said, "Be quiet. I wish to hear what they say." And when he opened the tower door and called to Charming, who came very sadly, and kissed the king's hand, saying, "What have I done, sire, to deserve this cruel treatment?" "You mocked me and my ambassador," said the king, "and you said that if I had sent you to the Princess Goldilocks, that you would certainly have brought her back." "It is quite true, sire," replied Charming. "I should have drawn such a picture of you, and represented your good qualities in such a way, that I am certain the princess would have found you irresistible. But I cannot see that there is in that to make you angry." The king could not see any cause for anger either, when the matter was presented to them in this light, and he began to frown very fiercely at the courtiers who had so misrepresented his favourite. So he took Charming back to the palace with him, and after seeing that they had a very good supper, he said to them, "You know that I love pretty Goldilocks as much as ever. Her refusal has not made me any different to me, but I don't know how to make her change her mind. I really should like you to send you, if you see you can persuade her to marry me." Charming replied that they were perfectly willing to go, and would set out the very next day. "But you must wait till I get a grand escort for you," said the king. But Charming said that they only wanted a good horse to ride, and the king, who was delighted at their being ready to start so promptly, gave them letters to the princess, and bade good speed. It was on Monday morning that they set out all alone upon the errand, thinking of nothing but how they could persuade Princess Goldilocks to marry the king. They had written a book. They had a writing book in pocket, and whenever any happy thought struck them, they dismounted from the horse and sat down under a tree to put it in the herring, which they were preparing for the princess before they forgot it. One day, when they had started at the very earliest dawn, and was riding over a great meadow, they suddenly had a capital idea, and springing from the horse, sat down under a willow tree which grew by a little river. When they had written it down, they were looking around, pleased to find themselves in such a pretty place, when all at once saw a great golden carp lying gasping and exhausted upon the grass. Leaping after little flies, she had thrown herself high upon the bank, where she had lain till she was nearly dead. Charming had pity upon her, and though they couldn't help thinking that she would have been very nice for dinner, picked her up gently and put her back into the water. As soon as Dame Carp felt the refreshing coolness of the water, she sank down joyfully to the bottom of the river. Then, swimming up to the bank, quite boldly she said, "I thank you, Charming, for your kindness you have done me. You have saved my life. One day I will repay you." So saying, she sank down into the water again, leaving Charming greatly astonished at her politeness. Another day, as they journeyed on, they saw a raven in great distress. The poor bird was closely pursued by an eagle, which would soon have eaten it up, had not Charming quickly fitted an arrow to their bow and shot the eagle dead. The raven perched upon a tree very joyfully. "Charming," said he, "it is very generous of you to rescue a poor raven. I am not ungrateful. Day I will repay you." Charming thought it was very nice of the raven to say so, and went on their way. Before the sun rose, they found themselves in a thick wood, where it was too dark for them to see the path, and they heard an owl crying as if it were in despair. "Hark!" said they. "They must be an owl in great trouble. I am sure it has got into a snare." And they began to hunt about, and presently found a great net, which some bird-catcher had spread the night before. "What a pity it is that men do nothing but torment and persecute poor creatures when they do them no any harm," said they. And Charming took out a knife and cut the cords of the net, and the owl flitted away into the darkness, but then, turning with one flicker of her wings, she came back to Charming and said, "It does not need many words to tell you how great service you have done me. I was caught. In a few minutes the fowlers would have been here. Without your help I should have been killed. I am grateful, and one day I will repay you." These 3 adventures were the only ones of any consequence that befell Charming upon their journey, and they made all the haste they could to reach the palace of Princess Goldilocks. When they arrived, they thought everything they saw delightful and magnificent. Diamonds were as plenty as pebbles, and the gold and silver, the beautiful dresses, the sweetmeats, and pretty things that were everywhere quite amazed them. They thought to themselves, "If the princess consents to leave all this and come with me to marry the king, he may think himself lucky." Then they dressed themselves carefully in rich brocade, with scarlet and white plumes, and threw a splendid embroidered scarf over their shoulder, and looked as gay and as graceful as possible, presented themselves at the door of the palace, carrying in their arms a tiny pretty dog which they had bought on the way. The guard saluted them respectfully, and the messenger was sent to the princess to announce the arrival of Charming as ambassador of her neighbour, the king. "Charming," said the princess, "the name promises well. I have no doubt that they are as good-looking and fascinates everybody." "Indeed they do, madame," said all her maids of honour in one breath. "We saw them from the window of the garret, where we were spinning flax, and we could do nothing but look at them as long as they were in sight." "Well, to be sure," said the princess, "that's how you amuse yourselves, is it? Looking at strangers out the window? Be quick, and give me my blue satin embroidered dress, and comb out my golden hair. Let somebody make me fresh garlands of flower, and give me my high-heeled shoes and my fan, and tell them to sweep my great hall and my throne, for I want everyone to say I really am pretty Goldilocks." So you can imagine how all the maids scurried this way and that to make the princess ready, and how in their haste they knocked their heads together and hindered each other till she thought they would never have done. However, at last They led her into the gallery of the mirrors, that she might assure herself that nothing was lacking in her appearance, and then she mounted her throne of gold, ebony, and ivory, while her ladies took their guitars and began to sing softly. Then Charming was led in, and so struck with astonishment and admiration that at first not a word could they say, but presently took courage and delivered their harangue bravely, ending by begging the princess to spare them the disappointment of going back without her. "Dear Charming," answered she, "all the reasons you have given me are very good ones. I assure you that I should have more pleasure in obliging you than anyone else. But you must know that a month ago, as I was walking by the river with my ladies, I took off my glove, and as I did so, a ring that I was wearing slipped off my finger and rolled into the water. As I valued it more than my kingdom, you may imagine how vexed I was at losing it, and I vowed never to listen to any proposal of marriage unless the ambassador first brought me back my ring. So now you know what is expected of you, for if you talked for 15 days and 15 nights, you could not make me change my mind." Charming was very much surprised by this answer, but bowed low to the princess and begged her to accept the embroidered scarf and the tiny dog they had brought. But she answered that she did not want any presents, and that they were to remember what she had just told them. When they got back to their lodging, they went to bed without eating any supper, and their little dog, who was called Frisk, couldn't eat anything either, but came and lay down close to them. All night long Charming sighed and lamented. "How am I to find a ring that fell into the river a month ago?" said they. "It is useless to try. The princess must told me to do it on purpose, knowing it was impossible," and then sighed again. Frisk heard them and said, "My dear master, don't despair. The luck may change. You are too good not to be happy. Let us go down to the river as soon as it is light." But Charming only gave him 2 little pats and said nothing, and very soon they fell asleep. At the first glimmer of dawn, Frisk began to jump about, and when he had walked Charming, they went out together, first into the garden and down to the river's bank, where they wandered up and down. Charming was thinking sadly of having to go back unsuccessful, when they heard someone calling, "Charming! Charming!" They looked across all about them and thought they must be dreaming, as they could not see anybody. Then they walked on, and the voice called again, "Charming! Charming!" "Who calls me?" they said. Frisk, who was very small and could look closely into the water, cried out, "I see a golden carp coming!" And sure enough, there was the great carp, who said to Charming, "You saved my life in the meadow by the willow tree, and I promised that I would repay you. Take this. It is Princess Goldilocks' ring." Charming took the ring out of the dam carp's mouth, thanking her 1,000 times, and they and Tiny Frisk went straight to the palace, where someone told the princess that they were asking to see her. "Ah, poor dear," she said. "They must have come to say good-bye, finding it impossible to do as I asked." So in came Charming, who presented her with the ring and said, "Madame, I have done your bidding. Will it please you to marry my master?" When the princess saw her ring brought back to her unhurt, she was so astonished that she thought she must be dreaming. "Truly, Charming," she said, "you must be the favourite of some fairy, or you could never have found it." "Madame," answered Charming, "I was helped by nothing but my desire to obey your wishes." "Since you are so kind," she said, "perhaps you will do me another service, for till it is done, I will never marry. There is a princess not far from here whose name is Galifron, who once wanted to marry me, but when I refused, she uttered the most terrible threats against me and vowed that she would lay waste my country. But what could I do? I could not marry a frightful giant as tall as a tower, who eat up people as monkey eats chestnuts, and who talks so loud that everybody who has to listen to her becomes quite deaf. Nevertheless, she does not cease to persecute me, and to kill my subjects. So before I can listen to your proposal, you must kill her and bring me her head." Charming was rather dismayed at this comment, but answered, "Very well, Princess. I will fight this Gallifron. I believe that she will kill me, but at any rate I shall die in your defence." Then the princess was frightened, and said everything that she could to think of to prevent Charming from fighting the giant, but it was of no use, and Charming went out to arm themselves suitably. And then, taking little Frisk with them, they mounted their horse and set out for Gallifron's country. Everyone they met told them what a terrible giant Gallifron was, and that nobody dared to go near her. The more they heard, the more frightened they grew. Frisk tried to encourage them by saying, "While you are fighting the giant, dear master, I will go and bite her heels, and she shall stoop down to look at me, and you can kill her." Charming praised the little dog's plan, but knew that his help would do not much good. As they drew near the giant's castle, and saw, to their horror, that every path that led to it was strewn with bones, before long they saw Gallifron coming. Her head was higher than the tallest trees, and she sang in a terrible voice, "Bring out your little boys and girls, pray do not stay, do they curls, for I shall eat you so very many, I shall not know if they have any." Thereupon Charming sang out as loud as they could, to the same tune, come out, and meet the valiant Charming, who finds you not at all alarming. Although they are not very tall, they big enough to make you fall." The rhymes were not very correct, but you could see that Charming had made them up so quickly that it was a miracle that they were not worse, especially as they were horribly frightened at the time. When Gallifron had heard these words, she looked up all about her, and saw Charming, sword in hand, and this put the giant into a terrible rage, and she aimed a blow at Charming with her huge iron club, which would certainly have killed them if it had reached them. But in that instant a raven perched upon the giant's head, and pecking with its strong beak and beating with its great wings, so confused and blinded her that all her blows fell harmlessly upon the air. And Charming, rushing in, gave her several strokes with their sharp sword that she fell to the ground. Whereupon Charming cut off her head before she knew anything about it, and the raven from a tree close by croaked out, "You see, I have not forgotten the good term you did in me killing the eagle. Today I think I have fulfilled my promise of repaying you." "Indeed, I owe you more gratitude than you ever owed me," replied Charming. And then Charming mounted their horse and rode off with Gallifron's head. When they reached the city, the people ran out to them in crowds, crying, "Behold, the brave Charming who has killed the giant!" And their shouts reached the princess's ear, but she dared not ask what was happening, for she feared hearing that Charming had been killed. But very soon they arrived at the palace with the giant's head, of which she was still terrified, though it could no longer do her any harm. "Princess," said Charming, "I have killed your enemy. I hope you will now consent to marry the king, my master." "Oh, dear, no," said the princess. "Not until you have brought me some water from the gloomy cavern. Not far from here there is a deep cave, the entrance to which is guarded by 2 dragons with fiery eyes, who will not allow anyone to pass them. When you get into the cavern, you will find an immense hole which you must go down, and it is full of toads and snakes. At the bottom of this hole there is another little cave, in which rises the fountain of health and the beauty. It is some of this water that I really must have. Everything it touches becomes wonderful. The beautiful things will always remain beautiful, and the ugly things become lovely. If one is young, one never grows old, and if one is old, one becomes young. You see, Charming, I could never leave my kingdom without taking some of it with me." "Princess," said Charming, You at least can never need this water, but I am an unhappy ambassador whose death you desire. Where you send me, I will go, though I know I shall never return." And as the Princess Goldilocks showed no sign of relenting, Charming started with the little dog for the gloomy cavern. Everyone they met on the way said, "What a pity that an attractive person as they should be thrown away their life so carelessly. They are going to the cavern alone, though if they had 100 men with them, they could not succeed. Why does the princess ask impossibilities?" Charming said nothing, but was very sad. When they were near the top of the hill, they dismounted to let their horse graze, while Frisk amused himself by chasing flies. Charming knew they could not be far from the gloomy cavern, and on looking about them they saw a black hideous rock from which came thick smoke, followed in a moment by one of the dragons with fire blazing from his mouth and eyes. His body was yellow and green, his claws scarlet, and his tail was no so long that it lay in 100 coils. Frisk was so terrified at the sight of it that they did not know where to hide. Charming, quite determined to get the water or die, now drew their sword, and taking the crystal flask which pretty Goldilocks had given them to fill, said to Frisk, "I feel sure that I shall never come back from this expedition. When I am dead, go to the princess and tell her that her errand has cost me my life. Then find the king, my master, and relate all my adventures to them." As they spoke, they heard a voice calling, "Charming, Charming." "Who calls me?" said Charming. Then they saw an owl sitting in a hollow tree, who said to them, "You saved my life when I was caught in the net. Now I can repay you. Trust me with the flask, for I know all the ways of the gloomy cavern, and can fill it from the fountain of beauty." Charming was only too glad to give her the flask, and she flitted into the cavern, quite unnoticed by the dragon, and after some time returned with the flask filled to the very brim with sparkling water. Charming thanked her with her heart, and joyfully hastened back to town. Charming went straight to the palace, and gave the flask to the princess, who had no further objection to make. So she thanked Charming, and ordered that preparations should be made for her departure, and they soon set out together. The princess found Charming such an agreeable companion that she sometimes said to them, "Why didn't we stay where we were? I could have made you ruler, and you would have been so happy." But Charming only answered, "I could not have done anything that would have vexed my master so much, even for a kingdom, or to please you, though I think you are as beautiful as the sun." At last they reached the king's great city, and he came out to meet the princess, bringing magnificent presents, and the marriage was celebrated with great rejoicing. But Goldilocks was so fond of Charming that she was not happy unless they were near her, and she was always singing their praises. "If it hadn't been for Charming," she said to the king, "I should never have come here. You ought to be very much obliged to them, for they did the most impossible things, and gave me water from the fountain of beauty, so that I never grow old, and shall get prettier every year." And then Charming's enemies said to the king, "It is a wonder that you are not jealous. The queen thinks there is nobody in the world like Charming, as if anybody you had sent could not have done just as much." "It is quite true. Now I come to think of it," said the king. "Let Charming be chained hand and foot, and throw them into the tower." So they took Charming, and as a reward for having served the king so faithfully, they shut them up in the tower, where they only saw the Ghoulier, who brought them a piece of black bread and a pitcher of water every day. However, little Frisk came to console them, and told them all the news. When pretty Goldilocks heard about what had happened, she threw herself at the king's feet and begged him to set Charming free. But the more she cried, the more angry he was, and at last she saw that it was useless to say any more, but it made her very sad. Then the king took it in his head that perhaps he was not handsome enough to please the Princess Goldilocks, and he thought he would bathe his face with the water from the Fountain of Beauty, which was in the flask on the shelf in the princess's room, where she had placed it that she might see it often. Now, it happened that one of the princess's ladies, in chasing a spider, had knocked the flask off the shelf and broken it, and every drop of water had been spilt. Not knowing what to do, she had hastily swept away the pieces of crystal, and then remembered that in the king's room she had seen a flask of exactly the same shape. So she filled that with sparkling water. So, without saying a word, she fetched it and stood it upon the queen's shelf. Now, the water in this flask was what was used in the kingdom for getting rid of troublesome people. Instead of having their heads cut off in the usual way, their faces were bathed with water, and they instantly fell asleep and never woke up any more. So, when the king, thinking to improve his beauty, took the flask and sprinkled water upon his face, he fell asleep, and nobody could wake him. Little Frisk was the first to hear the news, and he ran to tell Charming, who sent them to beg the princess not to forget the poor prisoner. All the palace was in confusion on account of the king's death, but Tiny Frisk made his way through the crowd to the princess's side and said, "Madame, do not forget poor Charming." Then she remembered all Charming had done for her, and without saying a word to anyone, went straight to the tower, and with her own hands took off Charming's chains. Then putting a golden crown upon their head, and the royal mantle upon their shoulders, she said, "Come, faithful Charming, I make you ruler, and will take you for my partner." Charming, once more free and happy, fell at her feet and thanked her for her gracious words. Everybody was delighted that Charming should be ruler, and that the wedding which took place at once was the prettiest that can be imagined, and that Charming and Princess Goldilocks lived happily ever after.
This is CICK 93.9 FM Smithers Community Radio, and you're listening to the national award-winning show, River Reads, hosted by narrator, River Wild. As a non-profit community radio station, we rely on our silver sponsors, like Mountain Eagle Books. Thank you, Mountain Eagle Books, for your invaluable support towards promoting local music and community radio. Now, let's continue with our scheduled programming.
The following is rated PG-D, meaning it contains possible gore or death. It's pretty tame, but someone is killed.
Listeners' discretion is advised. The Water Lily, The Gold Spinners, from the Blue Fairy Book, edited by Andrew Lang. Once upon a time, in a large forest, there lived an old woman and 3 maidens. They were all 3 beautiful, but the youngest was the fairest. Their hut was quite hidden by trees, and none saw their beauty but the sun by day, and the moon by night, and the eyes of the stars. The old woman kept the girls hard at work from morning till night, spinning gold flax into yarn, and when one distaff was empty, another was given them, so they had no rest. The thread had to be fine and even, and when done was locked up in a secret chamber by the old woman, who twice or thrice every summer went on a journey. Before she went, she gave out work for each day of her absence, and always returned in the night, so that the girls never saw what she brought back with her. Neither would she tell them whence the gold flax came, nor what it would be used for. Now, When the time came round for the old woman to set out on one of these journeys, she gave each maiden work for 6 days, with the usual warning. "Children, don't let your eyes wander, and on no account speak to a man, for if you do, your thread will lose its brightness, and misfortunes of all kinds will follow." They laughed at this oft-repeated caution, saying to each other, "How can our gold threads lose its brightness, and have we any chance of speaking to a man?" On the 3rd day, after the old woman's departure, a young prince hunting in the forest got separated from his companions and completely lost. Weary of seeking his way, he flung himself down under a tree, leaving his horse to browse at will, and fell asleep. The sun had set when he awoke, and began once more to try and find his way out of the forest. At last he perceived a narrow footpath, which he eagerly followed, and found that it led him to a small hut. The maidens, who were sitting at the door of their hut for coolness, saw him approaching, and the 2 elder were much alarmed, for they remembered the old woman's warning. But the youngest said, "Never before have I seen anyone like him. Let me have one look." They entreated her to come in, but seeing that she would not, left her, and the prince, coming up, courteously greeted the maiden, and told her he had lost his way in the forest, and was both hungry and weary. She set food before him, and was so delighted with his conversations that she forgot the old woman's caution, and lingered for hours. In the meantime, the prince's companions sought him far and wide, but to no purpose, so they sent 2 messengers to tell the sad news to the king, who immediately ordered a regiment of cavalry and one of the infantry to go and look for him. After 3 days' search, they found the hut. The prince was still sitting by the door, and had been so happy in the maiden's company that time had seemed like a single hour. Before leaving, he promised to return and fetch her to his father's court, where he would make her his bride. When he had gone, she sat down to her wheel to make up for the lost time, but was dismayed to find that her thread had lost all its brightness. Her heart beat fast, and she wept bitterly, for she remembered the old woman's warning, and knew not what misfortune might now befall her. The old woman returned in the night, and knew by the tarnished thread what had happened in her absence. She was furiously angry, and told the maiden that she had brought down misery both on herself and on the prince. The maiden could not rest for thinking of this. At last she could bear it no longer, and resolved to seek help from the prince. As a child, she had learned to understand the speech of birds, and this was now of great use to her, for, seeing a raven pluming itself on a pine bough, she cried softly to it, "Dear bird, cleverest of all birds, as well as swiftest of wing, wilt thou help me?" "How can I help thee?" asked the raven. She answered, "Fly away until thou comest to a splendid town. There stands a king's palace. See thou the king's son. Tell him that great misfortune has befallen me." Then she told the raven how her thread had lost its brightness, how terribly angry the old woman was, and how she feared some great disaster. The raven promised faithfully to do her bidding, and spread its wings, flew away. The maiden now went home, and worked hard all day at winding up the yarn her elder sisters had spun, for the old woman would let her spin no longer. Towards evening she heard the raven's "Cra! Cra!" from the pine tree, and eagerly hastened therein to hear the answer. By great good fortune the raven had found a wind wizard's son in the palace garden, for who understood the speech of birds, and to him he had entrusted the message. When the prince heard it, he was very sorrowful, and took counsel with his friends how to free the maiden. Then they said to the wind's wizard's son, beg the raven to fly quickly back to the maiden and tell her to be ready on the 9th night, for then, when I come, and fetch her away." The Wind Wizard's son did this, and the raven flew so swiftly that it reached the hut the very same evening. The maiden thanked the bird heartily and went home, telling no one what she had heard. As the 9th night drew near, she became very unhappy, for she feared lest some terrible mischance should arise and ruin all. On the night she crept quietly out of the house, and waited trembling at some little distance from the hut. Presently she heard the muffled tramp of horses, and soon the armed troop appeared, led by the prince, who had prudently marked all the trees beforehand in order to know the way. When he saw the maiden, he sprang from his horse, lifted her into the saddle, and then, mounted behind, rode homewards. The moon shone so brightly that they had no difficulty in seeing the marked trees. By and by, the coming dawn loosened the tongues of all the birds, and had the prince had only known what they were saying, or the maiden been listening, they would have been spared much sorrow, for they were thinking only of each other, and when they came out of the forest the sun was high in the heavens. Next morning, when the youngest girl did not come to her work, the old woman asked where she was. The sisters pretended not to know, but the old woman easily guessed what had happened, and as she was in really a wicked witch, determined to punish the fugitives. Accordingly, she collected 9 different kinds of enchanters' nightshades, added some salt, which she first bewitched, and doing all in a cloth into the shape of a fluffy ball, sent it after them on the wings of the wind, saying, "Whirlwind, mother of the wind, lend they aid against her who sinned. Carry with thee this magic ball, cast her from his arms forever, bury her in the rippling river." At midday, the prince and his men came to a deep river spanned by so narrow a bridge that only one rider could cross at a time. The horse on which the prince and the maiden were riding had just reached the middle when the magic ball flew by. The horse, in its fright, suddenly reared, and before anyone could stop, it flung the maiden into the swift current below. The prince tried to jump in after her, but his men held him back, and in spite of his struggles led him home, where for 6 weeks he shut himself up in a secret chamber, and would neither eat nor drink, so great was his grief. At last he became so ill his life was despaired of, and in great alarm the king caused all the wizards of his country to be summoned, but none could cure him. At last the Wind Wizard's son said to the king, "Send for the old wizard from Finland. He knows more than all the wizards of your kingdom put together." A messenger was at once sent to Finland, and a week later the old wizard himself arrived on the wings of the wind. "Honored king," said the wizard, "the wind has blown this illness upon your son, and a magic ball has snatched away his beloved. This is which makes him grieve so constantly. Let the wind blow upon him, that it may blow away his sorrows." Then the king made his son go out into the world, into the wind, and he gradually recovered and told his father all. "Forget the maiden," said the king, "and take another bride." But the prince said he could never love another. A year afterwards, he came suddenly upon the bridge where his beloved had met her death. As he recalled the misfortune, he wept bitterly, and would have given all he possessed to have her once more alive. In the midst of his grief, he thought he heard a voice singing, and looked around. He could see no one. Then he heard the voice again, and it said, "Alas, bewitched and all forsaken, 'tis I must live for ever here. My beloved no thought has taken to free his bride that was so dear. He was greatly astonished, sprang from his horse, and looked everywhere to see if no one was hidden under the bridge. But no one was there. Then he noticed a yellow water lily floating on the surface of the water, half hidden by its broad leaves. But flowers do not sing, and in great surprise he waited, hoping to hear more. Then again the voice sang, Alas, bewitched and all forsaken, till I must lie forever here. My beloved no thought has taken to free his bride that was so dear. The prince suddenly remembered the gold spinners and said to himself, If I ride thither, who knows but that they could explain this to me? He at once rode to the hut and found the two maidens at the fountain. He told them what had befallen their sister the year before, and how he had twice heard a strange song, but yet could see no singer. They said that the yellow water lily could be none other than their sister, who was not dead, but transformed by the magic ball. Before he went to bed, the eldest made a cake of magic herbs, which she gave him to eat. In the night he dreamt that he was living in the forest and could understand all the birds said to each other. Next morning he told this to the maiden, and they said that they had charmed the cake that had caused it, and advised him to listen well to the birds and see what they could tell him. And when he had recovered his bride, they begged him to return and deliver them from their wretched bondage. Having promised this, he joyfully returned home, and as he was riding through the forest, he could perfectly understand all the birds were said. And he heard a thrush say to a magpie, How stupid men are! They can not understand the simplest thing. It is now quite a year since the maiden was transformed into a water lily, and though she sings so sadly that everyone going over the bridge must hear her, no one comes to her aid. Her former bridegroom rode over it a few days ago and heard her singing, but was no wiser than the rest. And is it to blame for all of her misfortunes, added the magpie, if he heeds only the words of men, she will remain a flower forever. She will soon be delivered with the matter only laid before the old wizard of Finland. After hearing this, the prince wondered how he could get a message conveyed to Finland. He heard one swallow say to another, Come, let us fly to Finland. We can build better nests there. Stop, kind friends, cried the prince. Will you do something for me? The birds consented, and he said, Take 1,000 greetings from me to the wizard of Finland, and ask him how I may restore a maiden transformed into a flower to her old form. The swallows flew away, and the prince rode on to the bridge. There he waited, hoping to hear the song, but the rushing of the water and the moaning of the wind, and disappointed, rode home. Shortly after, he was sitting in the garden, thinking that the swallows must have forgotten his message, when he saw an eagle flying above him. The bird gradually descended until it perched on a tree close to the prince and said, The wizard of Finland greets thee, and bids me say that thou must free the maiden thus. Go to the river, and smear thyself all over with mud, then say, From a man into a crab, and thou'lt whilst become a crab. Plunge boldly into the water. Swim as close as thou can to the water lily's roots, and loosen them from the mud and reeds. This done, fasten thy claws into the roots, and rise with them to the surface. Let the water lily flow all over the flower, and drift with the current until thou come to a mountain ash tree on the left bank. There is near it a large stone. Stop there and say, From a crab into a man, from a water lily into a maiden, and ye will both be restored to your own forms. Full of doubt and fear, The prince let some time pass before he was bold enough to attempt to rescue the maiden. Then a crow said to him, "Why dost thou hesitate? The old wizard has not told thee wrong, neither have the birds deceived thee. Hasten and dry the maiden's tears." "Nothing worse than death can befall me," thought the prince, "and death is better than endless sorrow." So he mounted his horse and went to the bridge. Again he heard the water lilies lament, and hesitating no longer, smeared himself all over with mud, and saying, "From a man into a crab," plunged into the river. For one moment the water hissed in his ears, and then all was silent. He swam up to the plant and began to loosen its roots, but so firmly were they fixed in the mud and reeds that they took him a long time. He then grasped them and rose to the surface, letting the water flow over the flower. The current carried them down the stream, but nowhere could he see the mountain ash. At last he saw it, and close by the large stone. Here he stopped and said, "From a crab into a man, from a water lily into a maiden," and to his delight found himself once more a prince, and the maiden was by his side. She was 10 times more beautiful than before, and wore a magnificent pale yellow robe, sparkling with jewels. She thanked him for having freed her from the cruel witch's power, and willingly consented to marry him. But when they came to the bridge where he had left his horse, it was nowhere to be seen, for, though the prince thought he had been a crab for only a few hours, he had in reality been under the water for more than 10 days. While they were wondering how they should reach his father's court, they saw a splendid coach driven by 6 gaily caparised horses coming along the bank. In this they drove to the palace. The king and the queen were at church weeping for their son, whom they had long mourned for dead. Great was their delight and astonishment when the prince entered, leading the beautiful maiden by the hand. The wedding was at once celebrated, and there was feasting and merry-making throughout the kingdom for 6 weeks. Some time afterwards, the prince and his bride were sitting in the garden, when a crow said to them, "Ungrateful creatures, have ye forgotten 2 poor maidens who helped ye in your distress? Must they spin gold flax for ever? Have no pity on the old witch. The 3 maidens are princesses, whom she stole away when they were children together, with all silver utensils when she turned into flax, gold flax. Poison were her fittest punishment." The prince was ashamed of having forgotten his promise, and set out at once, and by great good fortune reached the hut where the old woman was away. The maidens had dreamt that he was coming, and were ready to go with him. But first they made a cake in which they put poison, and left it on a table where the old woman was likely to see it when she returned. She did see it, and thought it looked so tempting that she greedily ate it up, and at once died. In the secret chamber were found 50 wagon loads of gold flax, and as much more was discovered buried. The hut was razed to the ground, and the prince and his bride and her 2 sisters lived happily ever after.
Gender Blender.
This week's River Reads Gender Blender tale was The Story of Pretty Goldilocks.
The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the radio station and any entities they represent. In addition, the stories, and any possible twisted messages relayed, do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of the host, twisted as they are and despite what they might tell you, or the radio station, or their affiliates, or any entities they represent, and solely are those of the author, if even that, for that matter. Also, just now, I'm referring to the host being twisted, not the station being twisted, even if they happen to be so, and that's all I'm saying about that.
As a non-profit, we rely on sponsors like Smithers Brewing Company. Thank you, Smithers Brewing Company, for supporting local community radio.
This is CICK 93.9 FM Smithers Community Radio. You have been listening to River Reads, with host River Wild. For more River Reads, tune in weekly every Saturday at 10 a.m., and Sundays at 9 a.m. See you then.